The voice was coming from 75 meters outside the perimeter. That was the first fact Private First Class Samuel L. Felton Jr. had to work with. It was early on June 11, 1969, 2 miles west of An Hoa Combat Base, and Company C, 1st Battalion, 5th Marines had a 3-man listening post sitting forward of the company's night defensive position. Then, the attack came. The outpost went quiet. For a few minutes, nobody inside the perimeter knew whether the 3 Marines were alive, cut off, or already overrun. Felton managed to establish voice contact. All 3 answered. All 3 were wounded, and none of them could get back on their own. That is the whole problem in one picture. 75 meters, close enough to hear a man, too far to simply reach through the wire and pull him in. The battalion perimeter was supposed to make the Marines inside harder to get at. A listening post existed for the opposite reason. It sat forward, outside the main position, where men could hear and see things the Marines behind them might miss. That arrangement worked right up until the fighting moved across the space between the post and the company. Now the same distance that had given the listening post warning had become the distance the wounded men had to cross to survive. Felton was 19 years old. He was a fire team leader with Charlie Company, 1-5. The record does not give us a long speech from him. It does not give us the name of the most seriously wounded Marine at the listening post. It does not preserve a dramatic radio transcript. What it gives us is simpler. Communications with the 3-man post were lost. Felton reestablished voice contact. He learned that all 3 Marines were wounded. Then, he went out after them. There is a temptation with a story like this to hurry straight to that last sentence. I don't want to do that. The distance matters first. 75 meters is not far on a road. On a football field, it is a little over 80 yards. At night, under attack, between a defensive perimeter and an isolated listening post, it is a completely different measurement. You cannot treat that ground as empty just because nobody built anything on it. The Marines inside had their own fighting positions. The men outside had theirs. Between them was the part nobody controlled cleanly anymore. That is what Felton had to cross. Company C had been set in a battalion night defensive perimeter when the attack struck their sector with rockets, mortars, recoilless rifle fire, and automatic weapons. I am going to leave the weapons list there because the important point is not what every gun did. The important point is what the attack did to the map in Felton's head. A few minutes earlier, there had been a front, inside and outside, main position and listening post. Then the firing started, communications dropped, and those labels stopped being enough. The listening post was still American. The ground between it and the perimeter was no longer safely American. That is the decision chain in this story. First, somebody notices the post is no longer answering. Then, contact comes back. Then the company learns the Marines are alive. Then they learn the men cannot move back without help. Each answer makes the problem worse. If nobody had answered, the men inside would have had uncertainty. Once the 3 Marines answered, Felton had something harder: responsibility. I think a lot of older veterans will recognize that difference. A radio can make distance feel shorter without making it safer. You hear a familiar voice, and, for a second, your mind treats the man as if he were right beside you. Then, the conversation ends, and the ground between you is still there. Felton did not wait for the listening post to become a name in a morning report. He left his fighting position. The Navy Cross citation says he moved across open terrain toward the 3 Marines, even after he himself had been wounded. I am deliberately not turning that movement into a step-by-step description. The document does not need help from me. He was inside. They were outside. He went to them. When Felton reached the listening post, the problem split into 3 people instead of 1 radio call. 2 of the Marines were hurt, but still capable of moving with direction. The 3rd was in worse condition. Felton gave the men immediate aid and began getting them back toward the company. That sequence matters because a rescue is rarely one clean motion. The first useful decision was not bring everybody back. It was recognizing that the three men did not need the same kind of help. Two could still make part of the trip themselves. One could not. Felton directed the two less seriously wounded Marines toward the company lines. Then, he stayed with the third man. This is where the title becomes a little less tidy than the actual record. There was not one wounded Marine calling from outside the wire. There were three. The citation does not name the man Felton eventually carried, and I am not going to assign him a name from a casualty list just because it would make the story cleaner. What the record lets us say is that one of those three Marines could not return without being physically carried. So Felton picked him up. By then, the distance that had looked small from the perimeter had become very physical. Mud, water, a wounded man, Felton's own injury, and the company position still ahead. The citation says Felton carried the Marine through knee-deep mud and water in a rice paddy. You can learn a lot about this story from that one detail without adding anything dramatic to it. 75 meters on dry ground is one thing. 75 meters while supporting another man is another. The ground was not background. It was part of the rescue. That is exactly the kind of detail that disappears when an award citation is reduced to the word courage. Courage is the conclusion. Mud is the fact. If you served on a fixed perimeter in Vietnam, with listening posts or observation posts forward of the main line, I would be interested in one specific thing. When a post became cut off, what usually became the hardest part to coordinate from your side, simply knowing where the men were, keeping voice contact, or getting everybody back into the same perimeter. I suspect Marines from different units and different parts of the country will remember that very differently. Felton kept moving. The citation records a close enemy encounter during the return. I do not need to reconstruct it in detail. What matters to the story is that the route back was not open, and Felton still delivered the wounded Marine to the battalion aid station. That is a phrase worth slowing down over. Battalion aid station. Once the wounded man reached it, his world changed. Outside the perimeter, he depended on the few Marines who could reach him. At the aid station, he entered a system. Corpsmen, evacuation decisions, a chain moving away from the fight. Felton had crossed the short, dangerous distance that separated those two worlds. Then, he went back to the perimeter. That last part is easy to miss, because the rescue itself feels like a natural ending. It was not the end of the attack. The company still had a position to hold. Felton had been wounded. He had gone out to the listening post. He had gotten the three Marines back, and the company was still fighting. So he returned to his position. That makes the story structurally different from a lot of rescue accounts. There is no helicopter lifting away at the end, no door closing, no sudden quiet. The rescue finishes, and the larger night simply continues. Felton's Navy Cross citation says his actions were instrumental in saving the lives of several fellow Marines. That is the official language. I am more interested in the sequence underneath it. A listening post goes silent. One Marine gets voice contact back. 3 wounded men answer. 2 can move. 1 cannot. Felton goes out. 2 come back under their own power with help and direction. 1 comes back on Felton. Then, Felton goes back to the line. Nothing in that sequence requires us to invent what anybody was thinking. The choices are enough. There is also something very Marine about the listening post itself. A lot of people who did not serve imagine a defensive perimeter as a wall with everybody safely behind it. That is too clean. A perimeter depended on men being outside it too. Listening posts, patrols, movement between positions. Men sent forward because somebody had to know what was happening before it reached the main line. That meant the wire was never a complete division between danger and safety. It was a working boundary. Sometimes Marines crossed it because the mission required them to. On June 11th, Felton crossed it because 3 Marines on the other side could not come back. I have looked for the names of those 3 men. The Navy Cross citation does not provide them. That absence is important. Awards tend to preserve the name of the man being decorated. Unit records may preserve totals. Families preserve other names. And sometimes the man whose weight another Marine carried across a rice paddy survives in the public record only as the most seriously injured Marine. That is not because he mattered less. It is because documents are built for particular jobs. The citation's job was to explain why Samuel Felton received the Navy Cross. It was not written to tell us everything we would want to know 50 years later. That is where veteran communities can add something useful without turning memory into mythology. Someone from Charlie Company, 125, may remember who manned that listening post. Someone may have a roster. Someone may remember a nickname that never reached the citation. Those are the details worth adding to a record like this. Not a better speech. Not a cleaner ending. A name. Felton himself came home from Vietnam. He had been born in 1949 and grew up in Lorain, Ohio. He graduated from Lorain High School in 1968. Then, he went into the Marine Corps. The action near An Hoa happened the following year. He later received the Navy Cross and the Purple Heart. And after the war, he spent decades working with veterans and with people in his own community. There is another thing about Felton's later life that changes how I read the citation. He did not spend the next 50 years trying to turn one morning into a legend. The public record shows a veteran who kept working in ordinary places and then kept showing up for other veterans. That makes the old award language feel less like an ending and more like one page from a much longer file. By 2019, when Ohio put him into its Veterans Hall of Fame, the 19-year-old Marine from An Hoa was 70 years old. The distance between those 2 versions of the same man is almost impossible to put into one episode. But it is worth remembering when we read these citations. They freeze people at the age of the action. Felton stays 19 on June 11, 1969. The 3 Marines at the listening post stay wounded and waiting. The company stays under attack. The document never has to deal with birthdays, jobs, marriages, funerals, old photographs, veterans' meetings, or the question somebody eventually asks 50 years later. Do you remember who that man was? That is where history gets strange. The big facts become easier to verify with time. The small human facts can become harder. We know the unit. We know the date. We know the distance. We know the award. We may never know from the public citation which Marine Felton carried. And for this channel, that missing name matters more to me than inventing one would ever improve the story. That later life matters here for a reason. Not because I want to build a biography around one night. Because it tells us the man in the citation did not freeze in time at 19. Samuel Felton became an older veteran. He worked at U.S. Steel. He taught martial arts. He became active in veterans organizations. He helped other veterans. In 2019, he was inducted into the Ohio Veterans Hall of Fame. He died in 2020 at 70 years old. There is something useful about seeing both ends of that life. The citation gives us the young Marine crossing 75 meters. The obituary gives us the man who lived another half-century. Those records belong together, and neither one tells us the name of the Marine he carried. That is the unresolved part I would leave open. The distance is not unresolved. 75 meters. The place is not unresolved. 2 miles west of An Hoa Combat Base. The date is not unresolved. June 11, 1969. The unit is not unresolved. Company C, 1st Battalion, 5th Marines. The number of Marines at the listening post is not unresolved. 3. All wounded, all unable to return normally. And Felton established voice contact with them before he went out. That voice contact is what makes this different from a story about finding men after a fight. They were still part of the company's problem in real time. They could answer. The Marines inside knew they were there. Knowing made waiting harder. I keep thinking about the way the citation describes the moment. Not. Felton discovered 3 wounded Marines. He established voice contact. That comes first. Before the movement, before the carrying, before the award language. A voice crosses the distance before a man does. Then, somebody has to decide what that voice requires. There are plenty of Vietnam stories where the distance is measured in miles. Helicopters flying deep into Laos, pilots hiding in North Vietnam, patrols trying to reach a landing zone. This one is 75 meters. You could walk it in less than a minute under ordinary conditions. Nothing about June 11th was ordinary. The men inside could not treat those 75 meters casually. The men outside could not cross them without help. Felton made the distance smaller by going into it. That is all the explanation it needs. There is one more reason I prefer this version of the story to a more dramatic reconstruction. The record does not say Felton stood inside the wire, listening to one wounded Marine call his name again and again. That would make a good movie scene. I cannot verify it. What I can verify is better history. Communications were lost with a 3-man listening post. Felton reestablished voice contact. He learned all 3 Marines were wounded. He went out. He brought them back. And the Marine he carried all the way to the aid station remains unnamed in the citation that made Felton famous. Samuel L. Felton Jr. received the Navy Cross for June 11, 1969. The document preserves his name in full. For the man on his shoulder, it preserves only this: the most seriously injured Marine.